Before there was stop motion, there was the flipbook. Invented in 1860 and patented in 1868, flipbooks involved drawing the same images several times, but in a slightly different position. This way, when the pages were flipped rapidly, the image would appear to move. From this simple idea, both modern animation and the idea of stop motion were developed. The first stop motion was created in 1898, a now lost piece called the Humpty Dumpty Circus. The short was made by Albert Smith and J. Stuart Blackton. Smith claimed they'd used his daughter's toy circus pieces because they had movable joints, and described the process as tedious. He also claimed to have tried to convince his partner to patent the process, but Blackton believed it wasn't important enough. The short was about 4 minutes long and is said to have taken several months to make. Reviewers of the time expressed admiration for its creators. Blackton would go on to use the same technique to make an early piece of animation called the Enchanted Drawing in 1900. The Enchanted Drawing is an example of the original overlap between very early animation and stop motion. Some sources even categorize stop motion as a type of animation, though it is generally not thought of in this way when we talk about animated movies. In modern media, we now consider animation to be two-dimensional and stop motion to be done with three-dimensional objects, either freestanding, such as claymation, or with puppets. One of the earliest examples of stop-motion puppetry was done in the early 1900s. Starowich, a Russian-Polish animator, was known for using dead insects in stop motion, making characters out of them by using bits of wire to help pose them. Another experiment in stop motion involved a 1926 experimental movie created in Germany, using shadow boards created by Charlotte Reiniger. The Adventure of Prince Ahmed was an hour-long fairy tale that was somewhere between animation and stop motion. It is considered today to be the oldest animated feature-length film. In 1925, the first feature-length stop motion was released. The Lost World combined human stars and stop-motion dinosaurs to recreate Arthur Conan Doyle's famous book. The silent film was made by Willis O'Brien, who was brought in due to his work on one other stop-motion picture, The Ghost of Slumber Mountain. It is estimated that the original production was probably about 110 minutes long. Cuts were made for various releases, including the first ever in-flight showing for airplane passengers. A 68-minute version was shown at Astor Theatre, and a 5-minute version was even created for classrooms. It wasn't until the 1990s that most of the original production was able to be reassembled. The dinosaur characters were made from rubber, and due to the limits on stop motion at the time, they were only able to create about 5 seconds of film a day. Each miniature was about a foot long, and elaborate scaled sets were built to make them look gigantic and to give the impression that they were engaged with the human actors who acted in similarly designed sets. Initially, O'Brien wasn't able to combine the live actors and dinosaurs. Instead, he used split screens. The dinosaurs would fight, and the camera would cut away to humans watching. Through experimentation and practice, O'Brien learned to overlay his shots and make an even more believable, fleshed-out vision. He would go on to use these skills in making King Kong, the first of the now famous giant monster movies. King Kong was released in 1933 and was the first time that movies showed a completely fantasy image appeared to interact with a human actor. Previously, these had been done with actors in rubber suits, such as the Monkey Man in The Lost World. Scenes that sought to convey size did so by overlaying the film to place humans in scenes with the so-called monsters with no real interaction. It was this new technique that allowed King Kong to have his now famous fascination with Ann Darrow, played by Fay Wray. This not only made Kong a character in his own right, but gave him an actual relationship with the human actors. It made an 18-inch rubber miniature into a humanized being to be afraid of, and then empathized and pitied. It also made the movie an instant hit. With King Kong's success came a sequel only 9 months later, and in the early 1960s, Kong would join Godzilla to be the star of King Kong vs. Godzilla. Unfortunately, the Japanese designers of the movies elected to do away with the classic stop-motion look and have both monsters played by men in suits. Stop motion would continue to be a popular method of creating giant monsters over the next several decades. Often these grotesque and fascinating creatures had only bit parts in movies, as in 1955's It Came from Beneath the Sea and 1963's Jason and the Argonauts. By 1993, available cameras had improved, and stop motion was brought into the mainstream with The Nightmare Before Christmas. While not a giant monster movie like many of its predecessors, Nightmare was a family-friendly monster movie that was nominated for numerous awards and became so popular it developed its own line of toys, books, and video games. Due to its popularity, the movie has been re-released 6 times since its initial release. Unlike earlier monster movies, Nightmare Before Christmas was done with numerous puppets for each character. This not only allowed for a greater range of emotional expression, but for multiple scenes to be shot at once. It also guaranteed available replacements if anything broke during filming. There were 227 puppets created for Nightmare, and several of the puppets were created with interchangeable heads or faces in order to make it easy to change their emotions. It is estimated that around 400 heads were made for Jack alone. In 2009, a similar project was created, adapting the Neil Gaiman book Coraline. While the creatures in the story are less obviously monstrous than in Nightmare, the tone of Coraline makes it a significantly darker movie, and stop motion became the perfect medium for conveying the tone of the book into a visual form. Like Nightmare, the Coraline puppets were also designed to be expressive, with the use of removable parts, and were said to be able to show over 200,000 different expressions. This doesn't even account for the complex puppetry, which enabled each puppet to have an amazing amount of body language capability. Using stop motion gave producers the perfect balance between the weirdness afforded by animation and the right amount of realism to make it truly disturbing. While stop motion has helped to advance many aspects of movie making and has been used in multiple genres, its advance into the world of motion pictures was certainly defined through the monster movie. And there, whether it be kaiju horror or children's morality stories, it has continued to make its mark for almost 100 years. While stop-motion movies are a niche delight for many, its main use was often in more subtle placement in movie special effects. Up through the 80s and very early 90s, stop-motion continued to be the best way to convey size for imposing antagonists and very realistic movement shots. Some of the most famous set pieces from some of the most classic movies use stop-motion in the original releases. Star Wars uses stop-motion in several places, probably most famously in the 1980s The Empire Strikes Back. At the Battle of Hoth, stop-motion powers the effects for the Imperial walkers, the death-defying climb into one of them, and even some of the flight effects. Not only did stop-motion allow for a sense of size and make the walkers imposing, but a new form of stop-motion was developed for the movie, which added a blurring between shots in order to make movement look more realistic. This became known as go motion. Go motion would become the standard in stop motion for several famous films in the 1980s, bringing to life famous horror and sci-fi antagonists in a number of movies. This included several scenes animating the terror dogs of the 1984's Ghostbusters. When motionless, the dogs were giant puppets, with bodies and heads animated both by people inside it and by a set of external controls. However, when running, smaller stop-motion puppets were used for the chase scenes. How much smaller? A backup model of one of these stop-motion puppets was sold at auction and was only a couple of feet long. This shows you how effective cameras can be at making dimensions look larger or smaller with a little trickery. Robots also make for excellent stop-motion topics. Especially since photography could be spotty in 1987, the jerky motions one might expect to see in a machine were actually made more realistic by the stop motion of the decade. While this motion might not be expected in something like the Terminator movies, the ED-209 in RoboCop, with its clunky, top-heavy design, is perfect. Like with the Terror Dogs, 2 different versions of the ED-209 were created. One large version built out of fiberglass and wood that had limited motion, and a smaller version used for the stop motion. An entertaining piece of trivia: despite both models being exactly the same design, the larger one was so heavy that it settled when put together, meaning not all of the shots for the ED-209 are identical if you put them side by side. Not only science fiction used stop motion in its production. Dragon Slayer, a fantasy movie from 1981, required even more fanciful elements in order to achieve the grand spectacle the production team was looking for. The dragon was so complex that designing the different models and mechanics took up a full quarter of the film's budget. Everything from small models used for close-up shots to giant portions of the dragon were designed to give the dragon a realistic sense of menace. Go motion was a huge part of the production due to the emphasis placed on the movement of the creatures, and computer programming was used to make the motion of the dragon's flight look even smoother. Unfortunately, the average movie cost only $11 million at the time, and Dragon Slayer cost $18 million to make. The box office took in only $14 million, so while it did go on to become a cult classic, it lost the studio money. Critics blamed this on the writer's attempts to place modern motives and ethics into medieval characters, as well as calling it unoriginal and too much like Star Wars. Still, praise for the film's special effects was unanimous, and many filmmakers who followed stated that they were inspired by the movie. 1993 was the year Nightmare Before Christmas became the first stop-motion movie to be considered a success. Though initially, the box office success was moderate. Ironically, it was also the year that stop-motion use in special effects began to die. Jurassic Park, despite being famous for its use of practical effects, became the first major movie to abandon stop-motion in favor of the new kid in town, CGI. The dinosaurs were done with practical effects where possible, but originally the plan was to have supported them with stop motion. Instead, the production team elected to go the computer animated route. No one can deny the results were amazing, and computer-generated images have now become the stock for Hollywood. They are less time-consuming, having more fantastic capabilities, and often costing far less than its slower stock-motion counterpart. In addition, in an age where reshoots and rewrites are common, the need to build special sets and puppets for stop-motion films requires each production be planned with care long ahead of time. Travis Knight, the director of Kubo and the Two Strings, stated in an interview that just developing scripts and understanding the direction a stop movie will take can often take years before the production begins, because once things are created, there's very little option to go back and make changes. CGI can even imitate stop motion in many cases, making it even less worth a studio's time and money. While the movie Chicken Run was mostly stop motion when it came out in 2000, its sequel was largely CGI. The figures were scanned to make it look stop motion, and then animated using computer-generated programming to accomplish most of the effects. CGI also allowed background visuals to move, whereas in the first movie they remained largely still because they were too small. The original movie was received better, but studios may not always consider a 20-point difference in reviews to be worth the extra time and cost for production. More commonly, stop-motion movies end up being a mix of the original technology blended with more modern computer animation, camera work, special effects, and machine work. Even movies considered entirely stop-motion movies now, like Kubo and the Two Strings, use CGI to enhance the stop motion, to make background pieces and scenery look more animated, and to give more intensity to certain scenes. Puppets may be partially made by hand, but modern 3D and laser printers are also likely to be used. The interplay of technology and handcrafting has become so subtle that it is impossible to separate the two, only that stop motion looks smoother with each movie that comes out. And with CGI able to replicate stop motion more and more easily, one might wonder if the day will come that stop motion becomes the stuff of specialty movie makers, the Quentin Tarantinos of the world that love old movies and try and replicate them in their own works. 20 years from now, what kind of director will be needed to command the budgets, stage time, puppet masters, and care that go into making a truly one-of-a-kind stop motion movie? In 1940, Disney's animated Pinocchio took 2 years to make. According to articles on the topic, it took 750 artists and technicians to complete the film. Models were built for the artists to work from, to help make movement and animations more realistic. Compare this to Del Toro's version, which released in 2022. This epic project took 15 years to make, and even while planning for the movie, they were inventing the technology they would need as they went along. The puppets were works of art and technology that never could have been made when Del Toro first conceived of the project. Most of the humanoid puppets had tiny, fine-tuned mechanics that controlled their faces. Each turn of a gear changed a facial expression one notch for the next picture in a sequence. The animals, Sebastian J. Cricket and Spazzatura the monkey, were given metal facial features that swapped out because they didn't require the subtle movements, and their faces were too small for gear work. Each character took 6 months to a year to create and build, depending on how many copies of the puppet they needed. Pinocchio himself was 3D printed out of metal, the first puppet to be done this way. He needed to be durable enough for the filming requirements, and the metal allowed this. They also needed different sized Pinocchio puppets in order to do various shots and have the ratios with backgrounds and other characters look correct. This included his interactions with everything from the tiny Sebastian Cricket, which required a large Pinocchio bust to make Cricket look small, and a Pinocchio miniature about an inch high to make the terrible dogfish look monstrous. Since he was designed to look like wood, each copy of Pinocchio needed to have identical wood grain lines, and 3D printing was the easiest way to guarantee this. In addition, Pinocchio had around 3,000 faces printed, allowing his expressions to be changed out quickly for shots and giving him a less smooth, less human look than those characters around him. Filming alone took almost 3 years, with 60 sets shooting throughout. A single scene of a monkey moving through a carnival took 2 months to set up and a month to shoot. Despite this, Del Toro was able to complete his passion project for a budget of about $50 million. In interviews, Del Toro credited this to having his script and ideas in place ahead of time. He refused to take notes, allow studio interference or reshoots, and didn't do test screenings ahead of release. He stated that knowing what they were going to do and how, in advance, was able to bring their budget in at about half of what a major animated project would have been. It cost about a third of what the Disney CGI version cost that came out around the same time. Yet, until Netflix, no studio was willing to take the risk, even considering Del Toro's track record and fame. Those who didn't turn him down outright were only willing to take the project on if he was willing to use CGI. Del Toro said no. This isn't to say there's no CGI in Pinocchio. Like Kubo and other massive stop-motion pictures, visual effects are used to enhance some of the practical effects, give the world more depth and realism, and even in some cases to repair mistakes in the stop-motion photography. Limiting the use and careful artistry in the puppets kept the film from looking too animated, however. It was able to retain its realism and avoid looking like a cartoon. The Disney version of Pinocchio, well, Disneyfied the story. The 1883 tale by Carlo Collodi was longer, darker, and Pinocchio was a far worse child than simply being the naive puppet that the animated movie made him out to be. Disney Studios, as they often do, made a shallower version of the famous children's tale. It became a simple morality tale, just telling children don't lie. While the Disney version is much loved, Del Toro wanted his film to return to some of the original depth. However, he doesn't entirely return to the original tale. He cut many of the side stories that Pinocchio goes on, doesn't get quite as dark as the Collodi tale. Pinocchio's friend Candlewick is never turned into a donkey or dies in the harness because of his laziness, for instance. Del Toro also kept some of the Disney additions, such as the evil puppet show master Stromboli. Del Toro also doesn't stop with the simple moral of an immature puppet who learns to listen to adults in order to earn his wish. In fact, in this version, Pinocchio appears to have no desire to be a real boy at all. Instead, there is a relationship built on both sides, with father and son both needing to learn from one another. Pinocchio is not just a mischievous boy at the beginning of the movie, but a true horror. He contrasts all the more with Geppetto's lost son Carlo, who we saw briefly to be an extraordinarily well-behaved boy. While Pinocchio needs to learn to stop being selfish and destructive, Geppetto needs to accept Pinocchio for himself. There are undertones to the story as well. While the story takes place in Italy, as did Collodi's version, Del Toro brings the timeline forward to the 1930s and World War II. In this time, Pinocchio causes trouble for his father, not only as a troublesome son might any father, but as a dissident in a fascist society. Geppetto isn't afraid just as an old man might be when his puppet comes alive, but that puppet immediately follows him to church and gets him branded a heretic and a demon by the neighbors he's dependent on. As a result, he ends up under the eye of the town's military commander, a zealot slavishly devoted to the fascist cause and willing to sacrifice even his own son to the cause, much less one old man. Del Toro said in interviews that one of his goals in making this version of Pinocchio was for the contrast. He likened the frightened and obedient people in a fascist society to puppets, and stated he wanted to place the story of Pinocchio in a time where the only actual puppet was the one who didn't act controlled. Doing the entire film in the medium of puppetry was, in his mind, the only way to tell the tale properly. Quote, "It was very pertinent for me to make a story about a puppet with puppets, and the puppets believe they are not puppets." There is no doubt that Del Toro's Pinocchio is an artistic masterpiece. Ratings were excellent upon its release. It won awards and was favorably compared against every Pinocchio version ever made. And since there were 3 versions released in just 2022, there were lots of comparisons to be made. It cost less to make than the Disney version that year, rated higher, and made Netflix animation look good when pitted against Disney, which was probably enough of a win for them. However, Netflix, like most streaming services, does not release its numbers. They stated only that Del Toro's Pinocchio was its highest streaming movie for a week in December that year, right before Christmas when people are getting ready for the holidays. It was released only in a few select theaters in foreign countries where it made little money. It has been released onto Blu-ray and 4K DVD, a win for those of us who believe in physical media, but in several weeks of researching this project, I've been unable to find out how well those sales have done. And to be honest, when was the last time you heard anyone talking about it? With no easy answers on the film's financial returns, this could lead to a heavy conversation about how one determines value and the worth of a project. There are those that believe great art has value for its own sake. However, what determines great art has also always been a topic of discussion in and of itself. In the case of movies, most people would agree that pretty or interesting to look at are simply not enough. Movies are a visual medium, but they are a visual storytelling medium and must do both parts equally well. If they are unable to engage their audience, they have failed in their task, no matter how groundbreaking or different they tried to be. Pinocchio isn't the only stop-motion movie to face this question. Kubo and the Two Strings was completed for $60 million, only 10 more than Del Toro's project, and still far less than a major animated production. Like Del Toro's work, it received great ratings, critical acclaim, and awards for its craftsmanship. However, unlike Pinocchio, it did have a theatrical release and was only able to pull in a worldwide box office of $77 million, making it an overall failure when considering advertising costs. Looking at the top stop-motion films ever made, only 2, Chicken Run and Wallace and Gromit, were ever considered more than a moderate success at the box office. Even those that were social successes and retain name recognition are rarely considered real moneymakers. The Nightmare Before Christmas, considered the initial modern stop-motion success, has only made a little over $100 million over 7 releases. This makes one wonder, is stop-motion filmography on its way to dying for good? Having fallen out of favor with special effects artists, and with studios preferring to fake the look of stop-motion through CGI, how much longer will artistic projects like this be allowed to continue? How long until there are no studios willing to fund them? And with directors like James Cameron obsessed with pioneering the next big thing, will the old things continue to be appreciated at all? What do you think? Do you enjoy stop-motion? Do you think it's a thing of the past? What's your favorite stop-motion movie? Your favorite stop-motion special effect? Leave your answers in the comments. Looking to the future, please keep an eye out for my new show beginning next month called #TheBookIsBetter, where I will compare movies to their source materials, discuss the changes that were made and why, and look at whether or not the book is really better. I also plan to do interviews with independent authors about the world of writing and publishing, and perhaps in the future have some debate panels about book versus movies, if people are interested. Make sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with new developments. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Happy headbutting!